All right, so on behalf of the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Mosse Weinstein Center for Jewish Studies, I want to welcome everybody to our symposium today, Reading Spinoza. It's a great pleasure, and it's really wonderful to have everybody here, and especially welcome to our presenters. I thought I'd give a little bit of background on today's event, and then Sonny Yudkoff, my co-organizer, will lay the ground rules for the symposium today. A couple of years ago, we were really lucky and pleased to have been able to purchase a collection of works by and about Spinoza, about 50 books. These are 19th and early 20th century translations of Spinoza and works about Spinoza in about 5 books in German, and the rest mostly in Hebrew and Yiddish. The books were owned by Alan Nadler, one of today's presenters, and it must be said, my cousin. And now these books constitute the Alan Nadler Spinoza collection in Memorial Library at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Today's event is also, I should say, the purchase of this collection was made possible by the generosity of Roger Krauss, and we're very grateful to him for making it possible for us to acquire this wonderful collection. The co-sponsors of today's event include the Mosse Weinstein Center for Jewish Studies, the Department of Philosophy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, the Department of German, Nordic, and Slavic, which is Sonny's home, in Gaved, the Journal of Yiddish Studies, the George L. Mosse Program in History, and the Anonymous Fund of the College of Letters and Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And we're especially grateful to Todd Michelson Ambling, who is a librarian for Scandinavian Humanities and Memorial Library, for his work in cataloging and putting the collection together. And Kevin Cordillo, the German Language Humanities and Philosophy librarian at Memorial Library, for his assistance as well. So thanks to everybody, and I'll turn it over to Sonny.
Thank you, Steve, for that introduction. And I'm looking forward to this symposium today and to learning from you all. As Steve said, my name is Sonny Yudkoff, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of German, Nordic, and Slavic Plus, as well as the Mosse Weinstein Center for Jewish Studies. And I also direct the Mayern Institute for Yiddish Culture here on campus. And I have the job now of reviewing the format of today's event. So as Steve mentioned, at present, all participants are muted. And if you accidentally become unmuted during the talk and I mute you, please do not be offended. It's just to facilitate that we can all hear as best as possible. And this morning we'll have the pleasure of hearing from 3 talks, followed by 2 additional talks this afternoon. Each will be approximately 30 minutes in length, followed by 30 minutes of questions and answers. Following each talk this morning, please chat your questions to Steve directly, and Steve will relay them to the speaker. We also have enabled the chat function such that you can chat with each other, but please note that Zoom registers a record of the chat at the conclusion of the event. And this is a reminder that our event is being recorded. And before beginning the symposium, if I may, I just wanted to offer one anecdote. While doing research for my first book, which explored the literary and historical implications of a diagnosis of tuberculosis for Yiddish and Hebrew writers, I found myself spending a lot of time with a text called The Ballad of Denver Sanatorium. It was written by the Yiddish poet Hay Leivik, and it depicts the scene of 2 tuberculosis patients in a sanatorium. At one point, they're having a conversation and Spinoza's name comes up. And his name, in fact, appears throughout the extended ballad. And doing archival research for this project, I learned that Leivik had actually asked his wife to send him the Yiddish translation by Nathanson of Spinoza's Ethics. So why, I wondered, would Leivik want to read the philosopher while he was recuperating for tuberculosis in the Denver sanatorium? So why would he invoke Spinoza in the poem? And then I learned that Spinoza is said to have died of consumption. And I mention this because for the Yiddish and Hebrew writers whose work we'll encounter today, there are many Spinozas, some political, some ideological, and some for whom a biographical connection affords a point of recognition. So I look forward to examining these and other such points in the lectures to come. as we expand our understanding of what it means to learn in Spinoza, to read Spinoza, and to engage Spinoza across Yiddish and Hebrew. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Sunny. I realized I forgot to introduce myself. So that of course is Sunny Yudkov, who's one of the co-organizers of the symposium. My name is Stephen Nadler. I'm a professor in the philosophy department and also part of the Center for Jewish Studies. And I'm the director of the UW-Madison's Institute for Research in Humanities. So our first speaker today is Warren Zev Harvey. Zev is professor emeritus in the Department of Jewish Thought at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He is the author of innumerable articles on medieval and modern Jewish philosophy, as well as medieval Islamic philosophy, including works on Abraham ibn Ezra, Averroes, Maimonides, Gersonides, Chazdai Crescus, Spinoza, Moses Mendelssohn, Martin Buber, and many others, as well as the book Physics and Metaphysics in Chazdai Crescus. The title of his talk today is Jacob Klatzin, Spinoza's Heretical Hebrew Translator. And I'm going to share my screen because Zev has given me his handout, and that will appear on your screens in a second. All right. Does that look right, Sunny?
Looks right.
All right. All right, Zev, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Steve. Good morning, friends. It's a real pleasure for me to be here today, virtually at the University of Wisconsin, and to celebrate with you the acquisition of the Alan Nadler collection of books by and on Spinoza, or Shpinoza, in Hebrew, Yiddish, and German. Although it was a half century ago, it seems like only yesterday that now Professor Emeritus Alan Nadler was my student in a Jewish philosophy class at McGill University in Montreal. I was struck by his brilliance and wit, which enlivened the class, and I knew already then that he would become a distinguished scholar, a distinguished rabbi, and of course, a distinguished Epicurus. Of course, to be sure, the most distinguished Epicurus, or heretic, or infidel in modern times was Baruch Spinoza, who is the subject of today's Spinozium. Yes, Spinoza was a heretic, an Epicurus. Judaism has always had a warm spot in its heart for the true heretic, the Epicurus. I say the true heretic because there are true heretics and pseudo-heretics. Most people who think or claim that they are heretics are really pseudo-heretics. The true heretic is a great scholar who rebels against religion. For the true heretic, the Epicurus, Judaism has always had a warm spot in its heart. However, Judaism has always been very cool toward the ignoramus, the Am Haaretz, who doesn't know enough about religion to rebel against it. Anyone can be an ignoramus. Anyone can be an Am Haaretz. Only a very select few can be an Epicurus. The most famous true heretic of Talmudic times was Elisha ben Abuya, known as the other, Acher. He is described by the rabbis as being exceedingly wise, chacham, and courageous, brave, mighty, gibor, in his study of the Torah. See, this is where source number 1. And he is said to be one of the 4 great sages who entered the Pardes, the Garden of Secrets, source number 2. Yaakov Chazan, the famed socialist Zionist politician and educator, once lamented toward the end of his distinguished career, in source number 3, we wanted to raise a generation of heretics, but we raised a generation of ignoramuses. רצינו לגדל דור של אפיקורסים, וגידלנו דור של עמי הארץ. The failure of the Israeli education system is not that it produced secularists. After all, they wanted to produce secularists, but that the secularists, as far as their knowledge of Judaism goes, are not heretics, but ignoramuses, not Epicorsim, but Amei Haaretz. Truth to tell, It's not easy to find a true heretic. It's hard to find an Epicurus. Ignoramuses are much easier to find. At every corner one finds them. Elisha ben Abuya was a true heretic. Spinoza also was one, and so too was Jacob Klatzin. Among the hundreds of books in the Alan Nadler Spinoza collection, there are two important ones by Jacob Klatzin. One, his profound and insightful intellectual biography of Spinoza, written in Hebrew and published in 1923, almost 100 years ago. Two, his erudite and felicitous Latin to Hebrew translation of Spinoza's Ethics, called in Hebrew Torah Tamidot, which was published the following year in 1924. This translation by Jacob Klatzin remained the unrivaled standard Hebrew translation of the Ethics for 80 years, until Yirmiyahu Yovel's translation appeared in 2003. And even after the appearance of Yovel's translation, many use the translation of Klatzin. Jacob Klatzin was a true heretic, a true Epicurus. He was born in 1883 in the Grodno district of the then Russian Empire. He was the son of the brilliant and pious Rabbi Elijah Klatzin, later of Lublin and Jerusalem, the author of authoritative books of legal responsa and also popular sermons. As a youth, Jacob Klatzin proved himself an outstanding rabbinical scholar. However, at the age of 15, he left his Lithuanian yeshiva and went to Marburg to study philosophy with Hermann Cohen. In 1903, he participated in the Zionist Congress in Basel. He later edited Theodor Herzl's Zionist journal, Die Welt. In 1912, he received a doctorate in philosophy from Bern University. He was the editor of the original German Encyclopedia Judaica, of which 10 volumes appeared before the rise of Nazism. All students of Jewish philosophy are indebted to his invaluable 4-volume Thesaurus of Medieval Hebrew Philosophic Terms, which is an excellent dictionary of medieval Hebrew terms used by the Jewish philosophers. In addition, and a tremendous work of scholarship on Klatzin's part, which shows his great, amazing familiarity with the medieval Jewish philosophy. In addition, Klatzin wrote in Hebrew, German, and Yiddish about a dozen books on all kinds of philosophical themes, and he authored scores of beautifully written philosophic essays in Hebrew, in a striking Hebrew style that was at once learned, biblical, Talmudic, but utterly simple, unassuming, and terse. Louis Ginsburg, the great rabbinic scholar, stated that Klatzin wrote the best Hebrew of his generation. Like a true Epicurus, Jacob Klatzin was always on the inside and the outside at the same time. He was a rabbinic scholar, but he argued that Judaism has no distinctive spiritual or religious teaching. The Orthodox condemned him as the supreme Epicurus and criticized him for being a hedonist, a gourmand, and neglecting the commandments. However, the atheists were dumbfounded and scandalized to learn that this supreme Epicurus would sometimes arise at midnight to recite Tikkun Chatzot with the greatest reverence, passion, and tears. And sometimes he was even caught in the morning wearing his talit and tefillin. He was a loving and profound disciple of Hermann Cohen and wrote a superb book on Hermann Cohen's philosophy. Yet he devoted much of his scholarly energy to teaching and propagating the philosophy of Baruch Spinoza, the philosopher Hermann Cohen so profoundly despised. He was a zealous Zionist and radical denier of the diaspora, what's called Shlilat Galut. But he chose to live in Germany, in Switzerland, and in Chicago. even when his father moved to Jerusalem in 1925. Jacob Klatzin did not move there. He did not visit his father, although he did visit his father in 1929. In fact, he was there for Passover in 1929. And if we're entering the Passover holiday next week, maybe someone is interested in knowing this. Did he observe 1 day or 2 days or no days? There's a little story about that. If anyone's interested, I can mention it in the question period. He was a card-carrying Zionist, editor of Herzl's journal, but he rejected all Zionist ideologies, which spoke of reviving Jewish culture or Jewish religion or creating an ideal Jewish society. He made fun of Achad Ha'am, who spoke about justice as a Jewish value. And he said, justice is justice. It's a universal value. It's philosophical value. There's no such thing as Jewish justice. And he said Achad Ha'am was simply a chauvinist. Zionism for Jacob Klatzin meant only two simple things: territory for the Jewish people and a base for the Hebrew language. Arthur Hertzberg, in his classic anthology, his 1959 anthology, The Zionist Idea, described Klatzin as follows: the most devastating anti-traditionalist of all the rebels within Zionism. That's how Hertzberg defined the Klatzin in his classic book. The most devastating anti-traditionalist of all the rebels within Zionism. And the ironic thing about this definition is that Klatzin knew more about Jewish tradition than almost any of the other Zionist leaders or thinkers. Tremendous knowledge of all areas of Jewish tradition. But as far as he was concerned, Zionism means only two things: land and language, and has nothing to do with Jewish culture, Jewish religion, Jewish ethnic identity. He called his Zionism a formal nationalism. He was a deep admirer of Spinoza's ethics and metaphysics. He considered Spinoza to be a great philosopher. However, his Spinozism, like everything else of his, was unique and extraordinary. Like Spinoza scholars Harry Austen Wolfson and Leon Roth, Klatzin came to Spinoza from the study of medieval Jewish philosophy. There are a number of Spinoza scholars who came to Spinoza after first studying the great Jewish philosophers. And Klatzin was one of them. He studied Jewish philosophy, and then he discovered Spinoza. However, unlike Roth, and unlike Wolfson, and unlike all these other historians and philosophers who studied first the Jewish philosophers and then Spinoza, unlike them, Klatzin argued that there is absolutely nothing distinctively Jewish or Maimonidean about Spinoza's philosophy. There's nothing Jewish about Spinoza's philosophy. There's nothing Maimonidean about Spinoza's philosophy. He thought Spinoza didn't understand the classical Jewish texts. He was amazed at Spinoza's political criticism of the prophets and his taking the side of King Ahab against the prophet Elijah. He couldn't understand why Spinoza preferred the corrupt political establishment, namely the kings, to the bold rebels, namely the prophets. How could Spinoza defend the reactionaries and attack the progressives? Spinoza didn't understand the fire of the prophets, he wrote, the fire of their rebellion. In his beautiful Hebrew, in his sharp Hebrew, Klatzin wrote, Et hanevi'im lo hevin l'rucham, lo hirgish b'tza'aram, lo chash be'isham eish meri. Spinoza couldn't understand the prophets, couldn't understand the fire of the prophets because he had no poetic sense. He couldn't understand metaphors and figurative language. Spinoza was a literalist, according to Klatzin. He could only understand the literal sense. He had no poetic sense. And it's true if one looks through all Spinoza's works. he hardly ever cites a poem anyplace or quotes poetry. Even though the Amsterdam Jewish community was known for the emphasis they put on the study of Ibn Gvirol and Yehuda Halevi and the other Jewish poets, but this did not seem to make an impression on Spinoza. So according to Klatzin, Spinoza couldn't understand metaphors or figurative language, and Spinoza and Klatzin said the entire theological political treatise was a colossal failure of a very great man, a stumbling block on which he stumbled. Michshol shenichshal ben adam gadol. So source number 5. In the introduction to his 1924 Hebrew translation of the Ethics, Klatzin argued that the medieval Jewish philosophers, like Abraham ibn Ezra, Maimonides, Gersonides, and Chasdai Kreskas, did not have an appreciable or distinct influence on Spinoza's philosophy. However, he argued, they did have a very appreciable influence on Spinoza's language. So source number 6. Indeed, it was Klatzin's extraordinary claim that since Spinoza pursued his formative philosophical studies in Hebrew, studied Ibn Ezra, Maimonides, Gersonides, Kreskas, and all these great Jewish philosophers, and learned Latin imperfectly only at a late stage when he was already around 18, he may have written his ethics in Latin, but he conceived it and thought it in Hebrew. The Ethics is on the surface a Latin book, but deep down it is a Hebrew book. Let's look at number 6. If we look at the source number 6, he writes, there is no doubt that Spinoza did not have an adequate mastery of Latin. He began to study Latin when he was about 18 and never learned it thoroughly. The Hebrew, and in his book, Klatzin notes all kinds of errors in style that Spinoza makes in his Latin writing. So Spinoza never really mastered Latin. The Hebrew language is most competent for the translation of this book, namely the Ethics. Whether or not Spinoza was influenced in his thought by Jewish philosophy, he was definitely influenced by it in his language. By means of the Hebrew translation, now Klatzin speaks about his own Hebrew translation of the Ethics, several recondite statements are explained and elucidated, and furthermore, it emphasizes and reveals the character of the system. If you want to understand Spinoza's system, you have to read it in Hebrew. There is necessarily an advantage to a Hebrew translation of the Ethics over the translations in the languages of the West. If you're going to read Spinoza, you should read it in Hebrew, not in French or English or German. In fact, sometimes it is even superior to the Latin text. It's better to read Spinoza's Ethics in Hebrew than it is to read it in Latin. And then he goes on and he says, I am not hesitant to say that by means of the Hebrew translation, several opinions about Spinoza's system are debunked. I even think that this book, The Ethics, should not be translated again into the languages of the West without comparing the Hebrew translation, namely his own Hebrew translation, which from a certain standpoint is a sort of primary source, also in relation to the Latin text. Thus, Klatzin continued his own Hebrew. His own Hebrew translation was not simply a translation like the German, French, or English translations. It was in some uncanny sense the original. And Spinoza's Latin was in some sense like a translation. There is necessarily an advantage to the Hebrew translation. Sometimes it is superior to the Latin itself, which is in a sense a translation. Future translations of the Ethics into German, French, and English or other languages should have to consult his Hebrew translation, which was not merely a translation, but in a sense the original. To translate the Ethics into Hebrew, Klatzin Omer says, when I'm translating the Ethics into Hebrew, I'm not simply translating it into Hebrew, I'm restoring it back to Hebrew. Let's look at one example, which is source number 7. In the Ethics, part 1, axiom 6, Spinoza writes that the idea vera debet cum suo ideato convenire. How can this neat pair, idea and ideato, be translated? The idea and the object of the idea. Ed Curley, in his new translation of the Ethics, translates, a true idea must agree with its object. However, this doesn't capture Klatzin says this doesn't capture what's going on. Similar translations are made in German and French. Klatzin complains, Spinoza uses a simple pair, idea and ideato, idea and its object. But if you translate idea and its object, it doesn't preserve the direct relationship that you feel when you say in Latin, idea and ideato. Some translators try to solve the problem by adding, a true idea must agree with that of which it is the idea. But this makes sense, but it is too clumsy and convoluted to be an adequate translation of the simple idea and ideato. Klatzin translates idea as muskal with a long vowel, and he translates ideato as muskal with a short vowel. Similarly, in Ethics, part 2, proposition 7, scholium, Spinoza sets down the identity of Deus, Dei intellectus, and res ab ipso intellectas. Translating into German, French, and English, translators into German, French, and English don't know how to translate this statement. And the Latin too is awkward. Klatzin translates Elohim, Sechel Elohim, v'hadvarim hamuskalim al yado. At the bottom of all such examples is the simple Hebrew formula, God is the Sechel Maskil Umuskal. God is the knowledge, the knower, and the known. God is the Deya, the Yodea, and the Yadua. I think, in fact, that Spinoza is really thinking not so much of the Hebrew muskal, but of the Hebrew de'ah, because the word de'ah in Hebrew sounds a lot like the word idea in Latin, and it's basically a faux frere of the term. Franz Rosenzweig, in his fascinating book review of Klatzin's translation, agrees with Klatzin's extraordinary claim. Rosenzweig writes in source number 8, here we meet with a paradox. In the terminology of Jewish scholasticism, to which Spinoza himself refers in Ethics, part 2, 7 scholium, the group of concepts in question, namely God is the knower and the known, the group of concepts in question has found a formulation both coherent and lucid. And now Rosenzweig writes, so that the Hebrew translation by Klatzin is in the curious position of being more original than the original itself. Namely, Franz Rosenzweig completely agrees with Klatzin's extraordinary claim that his Hebrew is more original than Spinoza's Latin. Klatzin, like Spinoza, was a true lover of Hebrew. Nothing Jewish is distinctive or durable, according to Klatzin. Klatzin insisted, as far as he wasn't interested in preserving anything about the Jewish religion or the Jewish culture, the only thing that was distinctive or durable about the Jewish tradition was Hebrew. And this was held also by Spinoza. Spinoza may have had a profound distaste for the Jewish nation and for the Jewish religion and for Jewish culture, and perhaps especially for Jews, perhaps especially for Spanish Portuguese Jews. But Spinoza loved the Hebrew language. His love for Hebrew is clear from his discussions of the Hebrew language in the Theological Political Treatise, and of course from his highly original compendium of the Hebrew language, Hebrew grammar, extremely original Hebrew grammar that Spinoza wrote. Even Klatzin's astonishing idea that somehow the Ethics was a Hebrew book, and to understand it, one must know Hebrew. Even this crazy idea may be said to be Spinozistic. It's really a Spinozistic idea. Spinoza, after all, wrote the very same thing about the New Testament in Theological Political Treatise, chapter 7. Let's look at source 9. Spinoza writes in chapter 7 of the Theological Political Treatise, the history of Scripture must contain the nature and properties of the language in which the books of Scripture were written, in which their authors were accustomed to speak. Now, since all the writers, both of the Old Testament and the New, were Hebrews, it's certain that the history of the Hebrew language is necessary above all others, not only for understanding the books of the Old Testament, which were written in that language, but also for understanding those of the New Testament. For though they've been circulated in other languages, namely in Greek, nevertheless they are expressed in a Hebrew manner, Hebraizant. Spinoza, after all, is saying here the same thing that Klatzin said. The history of Scripture must contain the nature and properties of the language in which the books of Scripture were written, and which their authors were accustomed to speak. Now, since all the writers, both of the Old Testament and the New, were Hebrews, it's certain that the history of the Hebrew language, you have to know Hebrew, it's necessary above all others. Hebrew is more important than Greek or any other language, not only for understanding the books of the Old Testament, which were written in Hebrew, but also for understanding those of the New Testament. Though they've been circulated in other languages, namely, we happen to have Greek versions of the New Testament today, but really everything took place in Hebrew, and all those apostles and Jesus himself were speaking in Hebrew. So if you want to understand what really was going on in the New Testament, you have to know Hebrew. The New Testament, says Spinoza, was written in Greek, but if you want to understand it truly, you must know Hebrew. What the Hebraist Spinoza said about the New Testament, the Hebraist Klatzin said about Spinoza's ethics. It was written in Latin, but if you want to understand it truly, you have to read it in Hebrew, in Klatzin's own translation. Spinoza's philosophy wasn't Jewish at all, but you can only understand it in Hebrew. Thank you.
Thank you, Zev.